Thank you for joining me this evening, and that was a great introduction, so I don't have to say too much more about myself, but I will give you a little bit of background of how I ended up in Arizona. I came to the Hualapai Indian Reservation 19 years ago as a wildlife biologist. And just to kind of orient you, if not everybody's aware where Hualapai is, it's about 2 hours northwest of here. And so the Hualapai Indian Reservation is 1 million acres, and it follows 108 miles of the western stretch of the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River. And it's the tribe that's known for the skywalk and their ecotourism. And they're also culturally affiliated with the other Pi tribes, like Yavapai Prescott, Yavapai Apache down in Camp Verde, the Havasupai, and the Pai Pai of Baja, Mexico, as well as Fort McDowell, Yavapai. So there's an ancestral connection. And so they're a tribe that is in the human-speaking language family, and they follow the course of the Colorado River. That language family does. And so there's 14 tribes in that language family, and they all share an ancestral connection. And so I kind of landed at Hualapai in a way of speaking by chance. I received a Bureau of Indian Affairs scholarship, and they were trying to get more American Indians into science fields working on reservations. And so as part of the agreement of them funding a couple years of the end of my bachelor's, they would pair me with a tribe to work for. And so there was a few tribes that had openings, job openings, and Hualapai was most suited to what I had learned in my schooling. There was a tribe in Alaska and up at Nez Perce, and that was more fisheries, and so my background was more wildlife biology. So when I first came to the reservation, I was in charge of managing the big game species on the reservation. So in addition to the skywalk and the river rafting, the ecotourism that the tribe does as part of their revenue stream, they also market trophy hunting to the outside world. And so they issue tags on elk, desert bighorn sheep, and antelope. And so in my first position, I was charged with conducting the surveys, the population surveys, and making recommendations to the tribal council on how many tags to issue to have a safe harvest and not over-harvest. And it was through that initial position that I took a greater interest in learning about the plant knowledge. And so I had a fair amount of flexibility in my job, and with the permission of my boss and also going to the community members, I asked if I could write a grant to create a program to teach the ethnobotany knowledge to the youth, from elders to youth. And so ethnobotany is really just sort of the crossroads of anthropology, the study of human cultures, and botany, the study of plants. And so I was successful in attaining a modest grant from the Christensen Fund, a private philanthropy group. And so we embarked on our first program back in 2006, and we've been able to keep it going for the last 18 years through different grants. And so I eventually went back and did a master's. I focused on Hualapai ethnobotany as my thesis, and I shifted from working with the Natural Resource Department as a biologist to the cultural department, and I work at the Cultural Center where they hired me full-time to do ethnobotany programming and language revitalization and cultural heritage work when I finished my master's. And so it just worked out that way, and it's kind of interesting when I reflect on my own ancestry. It all kind of, the stars aligned, because on both sides of my family, I have family members that were deeply involved with plants. And so in the upper right-hand photo, you see my German relatives in Germany in their greenhouse. This was before World War I, and the little boy in the photo is my grandfather, and they immigrated to the United States just before World War I, and they came to Portland, Oregon. And so when he grew up, he continued the legacy of his parents, and he raised plants for a living, and that was his livelihood. And then on my father's side, I'm of both Kiowa and Oglala Sioux ancestry. And in the lower left, my great-grandmother, Spotted Wing, she was a plant medicine person, and so she knew all the healing plants. And so this relationship with plants runs deep when I think about it, when I reflect on it. And so I feel very grateful to be doing the work that I do, and I'm excited to share with you today about the Mojave Desert, and then about some of the tribal uses of the plants within the Mojave Desert. And I've had to pare down, this is kind of two combined lectures, and so at one time I was covering all of the tribes of the Mojave Desert, and it became too much. And so I've just kind of pared it down a little bit, and I'm going to focus on the Hualapai uses, which there's a lot of overlap with some of the other tribes. But kind of like when you're traveling at the airport and you're loading on the plane, and there's somebody that's like stuffing something in the overhead bin, and it's not fitting, and it's too much. That's how I design my lectures. There's too much. And so I'm going to be covering a lot of information, but I'm going to try and make it digestible. So this will be the structure of my lecture. Just an overview of deserts. And I want to talk a little bit about desert plant adaptations. How do all these plants survive in such an arid region? And then I'm going to touch on several different plant categories: rare plants, threatened and endangered plants, plants that I personally find interesting in the Mojave Desert, plants that are endemic to the Mojave Desert, meaning they're found nowhere else in the world. And then I'll get into the Hualapai tribal uses and talk about some of the other tribes that are affiliated with the Mojave Desert. You know, we have 4 North American deserts, and the 3 that are in our region, well, the Sonoran, the Mojave, and then over in Texas, you have the Chihuahuan Desert. Those 3 deserts are considered subtropical deserts. And so those type of deserts occur between 15 and 30 degrees latitude, either north or south of the equator, and it has to do with weather patterns. And then polar deserts, of course, are found in Arctic regions. So what all deserts have in common is at least 10% or 10 inches of rainfall or less. And so polar deserts are in Arctic regions where they don't receive a lot of precipitation, and mainly ice sheets. So this is even further north from the tundra, where there's almost no plants. So up in Greenland and down in Antarctica. And then cold winter deserts. We have one in the US, that's the Great Basin Desert. And these are areas that receive a lot of their precipitation in the wintertime through snow or rain. And they're often found in areas where there's large mountain ranges that will block coastal moisture that otherwise would come in. So with the Great Basin Desert, you know, you have the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevadas, and then with the Gobi Desert, you have the Himalayas, and then with the Patagonia Desert, the Andes. And then you have cool coastal deserts. And so one example is the Atacama Desert in Chile. Other examples exist. And so what happens in the coastal deserts is there's not really a lot of precipitation. The moisture comes in the form of fog. And so you have kind of hot winds that are coming off the continent, and you have cool coastal breezes that are coming from the ocean. And where those two meet, there's a weather pattern that affects the humidity, and it creates a scenario where you don't really get much precipitation. And so those plants become adapted to just coastal fog, and that's how they get their moisture. And so just my focus and my love is the Mojave Desert. I know that the Sonoran Desert usually takes the cake because it's got the beautiful saguaro cactus, and they are, of course, gorgeous. But the Mojave Desert has a real quiet solitude and beauty, and Joshua tree is one of my favorites, which is endemic to the Mojave. So a few interesting things about the Mojave. It's the smallest of the 4 North American deserts. 3/4 of the desert, the elevation is between 2,000 and 4,000 feet. And it's famous for having the hottest air temperature and surface temperature recorded on Earth, and the lowest elevation in North America. And that was over there in Death Valley. And so, so just what are a couple things that are special and amazing about the Mojave Desert? It's the smallest, hottest, and driest desert in North America, averaging 2 to 5 inches of annual precipitation. It has the greatest range of elevations. It contains some of the very oldest living plants on Earth, as well as a large number of wildflower annuals or spring ephemerals, which can live out their entire life cycle within just a few weeks or months. And so geologically, Mojave Desert is in the Basin and Range province. And so that lends itself to like large mountain ranges and open valleys continuously. And so what do we know about elevational changes as it relates to plants? Any thoughts on that? You get like a more diversity as you go up or down in elevation. You get changes. And so an interesting fact about Arizona is we have the 3rd richest botanical diversity in the country. And part of it may be due to like all the elevational differences that adds to the suite of different plants that can be found from the very low desert all the way up to the high mountains. I think the highest mountain is the San Francisco Peaks at around just under 13,000 feet. And so California is number one as far as the most species. Texas is number two, and we're number three. But what do we know about California and Texas? And I'm not talking politically, an interesting night to mention that. They're big states, right? They're big land masses. So if we were to do a weighted calculation of acreage to plant species, Arizona would be number one. Thank you, thank you. And so just besides basin and range province, besides the mountain ranges, just some prominent features that affect the landscape in the Mojave Desert are mountains, bajadas, which are the erosional features from the mountains, and playas, which is the open desert valleys. And then some additional features include canyons, floodplains, sand dunes, and wetlands. And so oftentimes, when you think about plants, especially if you're in botanical realms, you always think, oh, I have to study all my plant families so that I can figure out what's out there, so I can key it down to genus and hopefully down to species. So if you learn all your plant families, you learn the traits of different plants, like the mint family oftentimes has square stems, or the pea family has pods. Then you can figure out, what's out there. Well, another really important way to figure out what's out there is to learn some of these ecological habitats, and that's something that I really enjoy doing. So where plants grow depend on a variety of variables. This includes elevation, precipitation, groundwater, soil type, slope and aspect, so if it's a south-facing or north-facing, the terrain, the steepness of the terrain, and different mechanisms of seed dispersal. So this is just a few examples of what we have, archetype communities we have in the Mojave Desert. The creosote bush scrub, the black brush scrub, the alkali sink, which is areas with high salinity, Joshua tree woodlands, sagebrush scrub, pinyon juniper woodland, desert riparian, desert dry wash, saltbush scrub, desert dune. So if I were to try and classify the Prescott area, well, I know you have, in the surrounding area, you have the pinyon juniper forest, but like over towards like Skull Valley or headed towards Prescott Valley, you have all that scrub oak, and also the lemonade bush, the roost. So that would be like a scrub chaparral. That's not necessarily a Mojave Desert community, but when you can identify the communities, then you can start identifying the plants that are found in those communities, and it really helps you understand the ecology. And so just in talking about the desert plants, I feel like it's really important to talk about plant adaptations, because it's just so remarkable when you go out into the desert and it's 115 degrees, and you're just wondering, how on earth do these plants survive? They're really have made some, I guess, keen adaptations. And so I want to talk about some of the traits of deserts and how plants have adapted to those traits. So of course we have lack of water, temperature extremes, and salty soils. So how do plants deal with lack of water? Well, they evolve smaller leaves and stems. They evolve water storage mechanisms. They can go into dormant periods when they need to, when it's just too hot to operate. And they can develop nocturnal activity so that they operate in the cooler climate where they there's less desiccation. And so also we're dealing with temperature extremes. Because of the atmosphere contains little humidity to block the sun's rays, it entails these temperature extremes. So desert surfaces receive more than twice the solar radiation received by humid regions, and they lose almost twice as much heat at night. So you've got those major temperature extremes, which is another thing to adapt to. And then also accumulation of soils and minerals. So soils that form in arid climates are predominantly mineral soils with low organic content. Because there's low precipitation, water doesn't flush the desert soils of the salts and other soluble minerals, and so it just begins to build up. And even some areas, like some of these playas and basins, they don't even have an outlet. So even if it did rain, it's just all building up because there's no stream that takes it to the sea. And then another concept that's important to touch on is convergent evolution. So a lot of times when I'm sharing about plants, especially when I'm talking to kids, and I ask them to name some plants that they know that are from here, and everybody's like, oh, aloe vera. And then I'm like, no. Aloe vera is a euphorbia, and it comes from the African continent. But it looks just like our succulents that we have here. And what has happened over eons is plants on different continents that have no affiliation as far as their genetic lineage, they look just like one another because they're dealing with the same constraints. So the desert regions in Africa, desert regions in Australia, desert regions in the US, their plant lineages are not affiliated, they're not related. But they've developed the same mechanisms to survive. So they have spines, they have succulent water storage, they have pointy leaves, they have green stems, so they can photosynthesize through their stems. So all those things. So that's just an important thing to recognize and help you realize which plants are from here and which ones have been brought in, even if they happen to be lookalikes. And so some of the adaptations, I'm going to cover 8 of them, is developing a thick, waxy skin, large, fleshy stems, small leaves and stems, spines and thorns, deep roots, long, shallow, spreading roots, dormancy, and nocturnal activity. So I'm going to go into each of these in more detail. So having a thick, waxy skin is able to reduce water loss. And so when plants photosynthesize and they deal with transpiration, they have the potential to lose water, so that waxy coat helps reflect the sunlight and less water loss. And then, of course, having large fleshy stems to store water, either the leaves, the stems, or the roots, so the water is further conserved by reduced surface areas. And so also, in some cases, there's more surface area because in this example, this is Mojave mound cactus, and the structure of it is similar to the saguaro cactus. So you've noticed that it kind of has like an accordion shape where it goes in and out. Have you guys noticed that? And so that's an adaptation that allows, when there's a good adequate rainfall, the cactus can actually swell up without splitting open. And so that shape and design allows it to expand without having stretch marks, per se. And so, and then the other adaptations regarding this would be agaves that have few leaves, cactus that don't really have leaves. They have modified leaves, which are spines. And then other plants that are deciduous, meaning they'll drop their leaves during drought periods, and they'll photosynthesize through their other parts. So agaves with few leaves, cacti with no leaves. There's several, these are Sonoran examples, but these are several species that will, they'll have leaves when there's adequate rainfall, and then when it gets droughty, they'll drop their leaves. So ocotillo, this is the bujum, which is down in Baja region. It's related to the ocotillo. Very interesting looking plant. You can find this at the Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix if you care to look at one close up. And then the elephant tree, which you can find in Anza Borrego, parts of the Colorado Desert into the Sonoran Desert. And so these plants are able to lose their leaves when they need to. And then also reducing leaves, making them small, which reduces moisture loss. And then also a small leaf in the sun doesn't reach as high a temperature as a larger leaf. And then some desert plants are able to photosynthesize, during wet periods, and then when they drop their leaves, if they have green stems, they can photosynthesize that way until the water comes back, until the precipitation comes back. And then, of course, spines are used to protect them, cacti from predators. It also creates shade, and it's a form of plant propagation, and I'll get into that. So I said that it protects the plants, but there's always a few exceptions. And so the desert bighorn sheep seem to be able to get into the barrel cactus. The javelina seem to be able to eat the prickly pear, and the pack rats seem to find their way into gathering every thorny thing and making their defensive mound. But other than that, spines are pretty good deterrents. And also, you wouldn't think spines would provide shade, but if you look at the photo in the lower right, the magnitude of those spines literally creates an umbrella of shade to help the plant from desiccation. and then propagation. And so many of you may have had an encounter with a teddy bear cholla, also known as a jumping cholla. It seems like if you even get close enough, you might not even feel like you touched it, and all of a sudden it's on you. And those barbed stems hook onto animals, and then those stems are able to reroot and propagate through their stems. And so the spine structure is really key for some of these plants. The barbed stems being used for different purposes for the plants. And then, of course, deep roots. One of the greatest examples is the mesquite. On average, the root depths can drop into the water table 50 feet. There have been documented cases of as deep as 200 feet, which is pretty hard to fathom. I think that's the world record. And so you find these in dry desert washes, and so most of the time mesquite are often found along those washes, but you also find them in the open desert, and they're trying to tap into the water table. And then the other strategy, instead of deep roots, is long, wide, shallow roots, like the saguaro, that they say the roots fan out as far as it is tall. At least I've heard that. So that's another strategy to get at the surface water. And then drought dormancy. And so the ajo lily is a great example of this, where they'll just go into a dormant period and they'll store everything they need in the bulb. And as a perennial, they'll be able to come back when the period is right and that there's adequate rainfall. And then nocturnal activity. And so the acronym is CAM, and this is a kind of complicated science thing, but essentially most of the desert cacti and succulents in our region have adapted a different way to photosynthesize, so that when they're dealing with transpiration, which is the exchange of gases and also water, they do it at nighttime. And most of the other plants that are non-desert plants are just regular, what they call C3 plants. And so they're able to photosynthesize and do transpiration during the daytime. Well, the desert plants can photosynthesize during the day, but they can do their transpiration at night. And so they lose like 1/10 of the amount, or 10 times less, 1/10 as much as the other plants. They lose less water, if that makes sense. And now I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to cover some different topics. So I'm going to define these, and then we'll go into some of the plants that are within these categories. So rare is just a species that is difficult to be found, observed, or recorded. Something that's threatened is one that's likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. And then a species that is endangered is one that could potentially become extinct. And then interesting, of course, is highly subjective, and so you're going to be subjugated to my view of what's interesting. I limited myself to 10 Mojave plants, and I'll go into those. And then endemics. And so of the 3,000 species within the Mojave Desert, 200 are considered endemics, meaning they're found nowhere else in the world. And so a hot spot for some endemic organisms is over there at the Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge in Nevada. It has 30 endemic organisms. Some of them are plants, including this blazing star. And so when you're looking for rare plants, the easiest thing to think is, well, what are the rare environments? And if you find rare environments, you're probably going to find rare plants. And so that's one way I've kind of approached this thought. And so for the Mojave Desert, some of the rare areas would be alpine regions, very high part of mountain ranges, riparian alcoves where you have springs, and then sand dunes. And so within the mountain regions, you have small populations of Rocky Mountain white fir, and these are relic populations from the late Pleistocene, early Holocene period. So back in the last ice age, it was compared to now, it was a wetter, cooler climate, and so some of these plants, like the fir, were more widespread than they are today. And so with climate, coming out of the ice age and with things getting hotter and warmer, these plants have gone up in elevation, and so they're only found in these remote little alcoves, often in north-facing slopes where they get more shade, and they can still exist in the world. And so some of these locations are like around the Mojave Preserve. So in the Kingston, Providence, New York, and Clark Mountains, they have remnant stands of white firs. One of the mountains has 150 individuals, another has 30, and yet another has 1,000. So these kind of are in a delicate, fragile balance of being able to find that cool area where they can still persist on the landscape, but they're considered relic species for that reason. And so I put a blue X on Prescott so you can orient yourself, and then those yellow dots are those mountain ranges that I referenced. So if you ever want to take a road trip and find these plants, you have kind of a roundabout, you have a guiding map here, and then you can do your own research and locate those areas. And then also another great one is the bristlecone pine. And so a lot of this, many populations of the bristlecone, this particular species, the Pinus longavia, is found in the Great Basin Desert, but it also extends into the northern extent of the Mojave Desert, so that's why I included it. And these are considered the oldest non-clonal species on the planet, reaching as old as 5,000 years. They grow in isolated groves just below the tree line, and they live in very harsh conditions with temperature extremes, very short growing season, and very high winds. And so they're extremely rare, and they're found within California, Nevada, and Utah. And so some of the places, if you're interested in hiking to some of these really amazing, majestic trees, is Telescope Peak, the White Mountains, Mount Charleston, and the Inyo Mountain Range within the Mojave Desert. And then, of course, you can go up to the Great Basin Desert and find those as well. And so here, again, sort of a guiding map to find your way to these majestic trees. And then riparian alcoves. The desert fan palm is just really captured my attention. I just find it so remarkable that we have a native fan palm in Arizona. So there's about 2,500 palm trees in the worldwide. There's only 14 that are from the US. I believe most of them are in Florida. And we just only have one native to the west, which is found in California and Arizona and parts of Nevada. And so it's found in a few parts of the Mojave Desert, and it's also found within what they refer to as the Colorado Desert, which is a sub portion of the Sonoran Desert, which is west of the Colorado River. And so these have adapted to tap into the water table and the fault lines. And so these are found in little tiny riparian oases, and it's the largest fan palm of the 14 species in the US. So it has been used by the Kiowa Tribe for generations. Every part of the plant has been used. And these are really worth seeing. You can head over to Joshua Tree, and they've got quite a few over there. There's others in southern Nevada and a few other areas. And then sand dunes. These are considered uncommon ecological islands with habitat that can be floristically and ecologically distinct from surrounding habitats. And so when you think of deserts, I think of sand dunes. You think of Lawrence of Arabia. You think of a lot of different things. Well, of all the deserts in the world, actually only 1% of the deserts worldwide actually are made up of sand dunes. So they are rare ecological islands. And you get different plant complexes in different sand dunes. So you could have sand dunes 100 miles from each other, and they're going to have completely different rare plants than the neighboring sand dune, because they've just become, the speciation has taken place, and they've become ecological islands. So one of the plants that can be found there is the sticky buckwheat. This is a rare sand-loving annual that's endemic to southern Nevada and Mojave County, which is where I live in Mojave County. And so there's about 250 Eriogonum buckwheat genus plants, and this is a rare one that's only found in those sand dune areas around Lake Mead. And then I'll cover a couple examples of a threatened species, an endangered species, and a species of concern. And of course, there's many more than I'll be able to cover tonight, but I'll just have a token plant, and you get the idea that there's more plants of concern. So one is the Eureka Valley evening primrose. This is just a gorgeous, beautiful primrose plant, and it's found within Death Valley, within the Eureka Valley. And so it's endemic to that sand dune. And it had been listed as endangered. It may have been taken off the list. And so where I live, not too far from here, we've got a bunch of, this is primrose. It's in the Enotheria genus. And we've got a bunch of plants that look just like this. But it's not the same plant. And so that's something it's really interesting for botanists. They spend a lifetime looking at plants underneath a microscope. And even though this looks just like the one that grows down the road for me, it's not. It's not the same one at all. And if you look under a microscope, you can see, oh, well, this flower part is 1 millimeter longer, or whatever the case may be. And it sounds like, you've seen one primrose, you've seen them all. No, they're special, they're different. And just like people, and just like our pets, just like our animals, like, you've seen one dog, you've seen them all. No, they're all different and special and intrinsic. And so we have to remind ourselves of that when we see something and we think, it looks like that, I've seen that before. Another one is, this one is, I believe, threatened. It's being considered for listing. This is bear paw poppy. It's just a really striking looking plant because it has these very furry gray leaves, very easy to spot, and these bright yellow poppy-like flowers. And this is found in around the Lake Mead area, and it likes gypsum soils. So some plants are affiliated with certain soil complexes, and if you want to find that plant and you know the soils, then that's where you'll find the plant. And so learning what these plants like. And so this is just a really interesting looking one, and it's already very rare to the point where it's considered for listing. And then lo and behold, there's another one. How could there be another one? Well, there is, and it's over in the Grand Canyon. And botanists believe that this may be, if not a subspecies, an entirely new species. So I was able to do some field work in partnership with many different institutions. This is Wendy Hodgson from the Desert Botanical Garden, who does a lot of plant research. And we partnered with Grand Canyon National Park, the Hualapai Tribe, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and then U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We all came together on a mission to try and collect samples of this other bear paw poppy that's found on Mojave limestone. It's not found on gypsum soils. It's found on limestone, and it's slightly different. And so there's a chance that it's either a subspecies or an entirely new species, which would just make both populations even more special. And they're found on extremely remote, steep canyon hillsides, very far away on cliffs. And so we have our spotting scope, and we spend a great deal of time glassing, trying to find these plants. Some of them you would not survive if you see the cliff and you're like, okay, we're not going to get to that population unless we have a helicopter. But so we did a boat mission, and so we went up from Lake Mead, we went upriver, and we were able to do some pretty daredevil hikes and locate some of these populations, get more plant material so they can do genetic research, get voucher specimens, and be able to learn more about these plants. And then we'll switch gears and talk about a few Mojave Desert endemics. The most obvious one is the Joshua tree. And so the Joshua tree literally defines the boundaries of the Mojave Desert. And so the Joshua is endemic to the Mojave. The saguaro is endemic to the Sonoran. And if you've ever driven through Wickenburg, Arizona, you may be saying, wait a second, there's saguaro and there's Joshua trees and they grow together. How can they be endemics? Okay, well, there's always a gray area. So that's the ecotone where the Mojave and the Sonoran deserts meet. And so that kind of thing happens in life. But other than that, you can pretty much consider these endemic plants. And the Joshua tree is particularly special because it's considered a keystone plant. And so if something were to happen to it, it would affect many different species in the ecosystem. So oftentimes these trees are the only height in the area, and so they're important perching platforms for red-tailed hawks, which are later used also by screech owls. Scott's orioles like to build their nests in the Joshua trees, as do cactus wrens. Some of the woodpeckers like to peck into the trunk and nest in the cavity, and then later on you get screech owls that will use those nests and those holes, and then also a couple species of lizard will also use those burrows. And then even the ground cover is important habitat at nighttime. The fallen limbs provides habitat for other species of lizards, different species of beetles, snakes, nighttime crawlies, and so this one plant is just a tree of life for so many other species. And then the Mojave ring stem, this is such a fun one because it's so bizarre. If you look closely on the left, the stem is covered with this sticky resin. And so this plant has adapted at different intervals along the stem. It has like literally a sticky trap on it. And so what happens is these little tiny ants want to climb up and they want to steal the nectar from the flower without actually performing pollination. And so the plant has adapted this sticky defense mechanism, so when the ants try, they get stuck in the stickiness. So it's a sticky trap. But other species do pollinate these, and you look at the flower, it's so unique looking, and these big lettuce-like leaves. So it's just, this one is endemic to the Mojave Desert. There's other examples of ring stem in the same genus that you can find within Grand Canyon and other areas too. And then I'm gonna just kind of talk about some plants that I find quite interesting. This one is a fun one. I believe it's in the mint family. It just has a really bizarre looking flower. It's like a little paper bag, and the seeds are on the inside. And so after it matures, it waits for the wind, and that's what disperses the seeds. It also is drought deciduous, so it'll lose its leaves when it needs to, when it's droughty. And you can see that the stems are very green, so it can photosynthesize through the stems. Poor leaf, this is just striking looking plant because it's got very blue stems and leaves. And it's got, you can look closely on the flower, at the base of the flower, it has all these pores. It has a very strong, pungent scent. And so it just smells very strong. Some people don't care for the scent. Other people find it interesting. The scent also has an ability to fend off insects. And it was used medicinally by the Havasupai as a healing liniment for aches and pains. Turpentine broom, this is just a fun, odd-looking one. It's got these bright neon green, almost chartreuse stems, and this like deep royal purple flower. And then if you look at the fruit, it's got these glands on the fruit. It's in the citrus family. And this has a unique relationship with the swallowtail butterfly, which through scent is able to locate these plants, lay their eggs on the plant, and then the developing larvae will eat the parts of the plant. And by doing so, other predators will not eat the larvae because it has a funny taste. So something to do with the plant and the developing larvae deters predators. But the seeds are edible, so some animals are just seed dispersers, small animals. Mojave indigo bush, I remember the first time I saw this plant, I was driving near Lake Mead in Meadview, and I almost did run off the road. Thankfully, it was in the middle of nowhere, because I was just stunned by the striking beauty of these indigo blue flowers. I had never seen anything like it, and that's just the main reason I have that in this slideshow. It's just amazingly gorgeous. And it's got 7 other plants in the same genus throughout Arizona. And then Mojave yucca, this is just like a bolt of glory in April when the flowers come out, just gorgeous, beautiful flowers. And so these individual plants can live for hundreds of years, but they found out that these are actually clonal as well, and so they have, through measurements, projected that some of these plants could be as old as close to 12,000 years old through the clonal rings. And they have a lot of utilitarian uses. The roots can be used for soap. The leaves can be used for fiber. The flowers are edible. They're kind of bitter tasting. The fruit, the Kiowa would harvest the fruit before they ripen when they're less bitter and eat those. And then teddy bear cholla, I love these from a distance. They look very cuddly, and it's fun to see them in those like really rich volcanic soils. And they are able to propagate, through the stems and also through seed. The seed's not extremely viable, so the animals moving around the stems is an important part of its propagation. And then the purple sage, this one has just got a really beautiful, strong, sagey smell, and another gorgeous, beautiful flower. It's an insect wonderland, so when you come across this plant in nature, there are a bazillion pollinators on it. It's almost intimidating because they're just there, buzzing about. And this also has different tribal uses. Some of the Navajo uses are included in different ceremonial smokes, the leaves. And then beaver tail cactus. This one really has a wide range of elevations from like 2,000 to 6,000 feet. It's got the striking magenta, beautiful flowers that come out in April time. It has It does have an edible fruit. It's not necessarily as exciting as the Engelmann's prickly pear that has the big tunas, but it is edible, and the seeds are very large, and those were used by Kiowa. You can see the seeds. Those were ground up and used as like a flour or a meal. And then desert 5-spot, you can find this like in Anza Borrego and Death Valley. And this is just kind of one of those really unique looking Mojave desert plants that's just striking. It's in the globe mallow family. It's got the cool looking globe pink flower. The flowers close at night, and the leaves actually will track the sun, similar to how sunflower flowers track the sun. And then the smoke tree, this is a friend to the indigo bush. This is the larger version, and this is also striking if you catch it in bloom, which is rare. So most of the year, this plant loses its leaves and doesn't have flowers, and it just looks like a gray mass, or smoke. But when conditions are right in the springtime, when it leaves out, and especially when it flowers, it just becomes really a sight to behold. This is in the pea family. And so now I'm kind of switching gears, and I'm going to be talking about the tribal uses. And so I do want to acknowledge all the tribes that are found within the Mojave Desert. And so that includes the Western Shoshone, the Timbishaw, the Southern Paiute, the Chemehuevi, another Paiute subtribe, the Kaiwasu, the Vanyume, the Serrano, the Cahuilla, the Mojave, the Halchidoma, and the Hualapai. And I used to kind of go into some of the uses of those tribes, and it became too much to digest in one night. And so I'm just going to focus on the Hualapai ethnobotanical uses, and a lot of the uses have similar overlap, although each of the tribes have their own respective uses. And so just as a concept here, resource gathering was done in family groups over wide areas, but for at least part of each year, life centered on more permanent villages. The tribes knew much about the Mojave Desert resources, enabling them to gather supplies from all portions of their territories. And so you often hear like, Native Americans they're nomadic or they're semi-nomadic. And so a lot of times, like with Hualapai, they may have like their summer home and their winter home. And a friend of mine, he likes to joke. He's like, well, the Indians did it first, now all the celebrities are doing it, and all the rich people, they have their summer home and they have their winter home, but tribal people did it first. So also just an important thing to highlight is how important trade was. So for hundreds of years, tribal people knew the location of watering holes along the Mojave Trail, which allowed them to travel from the Colorado River to the Pacific Ocean, which travels right through the heart of the Mojave Desert. And so the Mojave Trail, the Mojave tribal members were one of the main people that followed that trail, and they were trade ambassadors. So they would go all the way to the Pacific Ocean, they would trade with the coastal tribes, they would bring their goods back to the interior, they would trade with the Chemehuevi, with the closest neighbor with the Hualapai and Havasupai would trade with the Hopi, and then the Hopi would trade with the other Pueblos. So you can see how shell and other materials made its way all the way into the interior, and then like yucca and turquoise made its way all the way to the coast. And we were able to start our ethnobotany program in 2006, and it's an intergenerational program that's really focused on harvesting field trips, and then we do classroom sessions where we bring what we've harvested back to the community and we prepare it, oftentimes in a traditional manner, or other times we'll do more contemporary spin on it. So I do want to acknowledge the tribal elders that I've worked with that have been so gracious to share their knowledge, not only with me, but with the next generation of plant knowledge bearers. So Georgine Paya, who I still work with at our office, the late Dolores Honga, Lucille Wadahamaji, the late Melinda Powski, the late Dre Cavatone, and Frank Mapatis. And so the teenagers in the first group was our very first group of ethnobotany youth, and now they have children of their own who are already in our program. We've been active for 18 years, and we've really grown in our programming and what we're able to accomplish. And so I'm going to just touch on a handful of plants, and then that'll conclude my presentation for tonight. So the mescal agave, some people know this as century plant. It was once thought that it takes 100 years to bloom. It does take many decades to bloom. This species, Agave utahensis, which is found on the reservation, takes 3 or 4 decades to bloom. And so here's a great photo of when it's in full bloom and then when it's gone to fruit. But you actually harvest this plant before it blossoms, because this is the only time in its entire life cycle that it's edible. And so most of the time it's full of all these saponins that are toxic and poisonous to humans. But when it's getting ready to create a flower blossom, it's creating all these sugars at the base of the plant that are getting ready to migrate up the flowering stalk to create nectar and attract pollinators. And so this is the only time that the plant is sweet. It's full of fructose and fructans. And so you harvest it at the base and you pop it out. And so you might wonder, well, if you're harvesting it before it flowers and pollinates, how does it create the next generation? Any thoughts on that?
Selective harvesting.
Well, that's one way you could do it. That is true. Yes? Exactly, they produce pups. So the way that the plant has adapted is it produces replicas, and they call the clones pups. And so it's through kind of at the bottom part of the plant, new stems come up that are genetic replicas. So when you do harvest it, you eliminate its ability to reproduce through sexual reproduction. So you do take away some of the genetic diversity, but you're not going to eliminate the plant from the landscape because you can do selective harvesting, and you can also know that by the time you harvest one, there's probably 20 replicas of the same plant. And so you pry it from the ground, and then you cut off all the green leaves. The Hualapai name is VL, and when in Hualapai the slang, "Hoa," that means like, oh my gosh. So we got a lot of VL that year, and we had since we had little kids, instead of big pickaxes, we bought these little S-hook crowbars because they were small enough for the kids to pry the agave out. Well, we were missing one of our crowbars, and we weren't going home until we found it, and everybody was getting cranky and wanted to go home and be back. We were way out on the edge of the canyon, like 2 hours from the community, and so we told the kids, we're not going back until you find it. And we thought, oh, I bet the tool is in the bed of the truck, underneath all of those agave hearts. So this one person had that idea, so we unloaded all of them. It wasn't there. We did find it, but we had to load everything back up. And so then you cut off all the leaves, and it's the inner white part, which they call the heart, or the head of the plant, that gets pit roasted underground. And it's kind of similar structurally to an artichoke. It has leaf fibers that are very fibrous, and so that part, when it gets pit roasted and it comes out of the ground, you chew on it, but you discard the fiber. And then when you get to the center part of the plant, you can eat it just like it has the texture of a baked squash. And for the Hualapai, they utilize a barrel cactus in the roasting process, which I haven't seen any other tribe do. And I think it has to do with the fact that Agave utahensis is one of the very smallest species of agave. And so by putting a barrel cactus in the roasting pit, it allows the agave to be steamed, and it won't burn the agave or scorch the agave. And so you line the pit with 4 direction stones and a heart stone. You put juniper wood in there, you light it on fire. And then the elder that's administering this whole process will select the youngest child that's born in the summertime to light the fire, and that will ensure that it burns nice and hot. And so then you place the barrel cactus slices on top of the hot coals after everything's burned down. So you wait 3 or 4 hours for the fire to burn down, just so you get the coals. Then the barrel cactus goes on top. And then, of course, everybody had tinfoil in pre-contact times, so you wrap the agave in tinfoil, and then you bury it. Of course, in days gone by, you could use an animal hide, or you could use the leaves of the agave to cover the mezcal so it doesn't get dirty, because you're going to dig it back up and eat it the next day. And so it roasts for 24 hours. It turns golden brown. And an interesting thing you wouldn't think of, but it produces a very sticky syrup. And so if you place little vessels in the roasting pit in strategic locations, you can capture that syrup. And the Hualapai swear by this, that it is like a beauty cream that you can place on your face, and it will make you younger looking. So we tried it one year. We saved all that syrup, and we got it in a vessel. And these were the Pai Pai ladies visiting from Baja, Mexico, and they're trying it on. Oh my gosh, they got younger. Did you see that? And then you can just, when the hearts come out of the ground, you can just pull off the leaves, chew on them, spit out the fiber. It's very sweet tasting, almost like molasses. And then with the extra, you can pound it out on the grinding stone and make a dried cake. And then that would be stored in wintertime, and then it could be used anytime you need. It can be rehydrated, mixed with other ingredients. Also, the stalk can be hollowed out and used as a quiver for arrows, for your bow and arrows. And so some of the items that I have at the table, you're welcome to take a look at when I'm done with the lecture and take a look at some of these items closer. The red berry sumac, this is called gitye. This is, makes a nice lemonade juice. So you gather the berries in June and in May. And you have to glean the berries. They're covered with a little stickiness, and twigs and leaves get in the way. So you throw it up in the air and let the wind take away the impurities. And the basket that she's using is made from the same stems of this plant. So this is an important basketry plant as well. And so you grind the berries on the grinding stone and mix it with water. Normally we make lemonade, but as you can see, we upgraded to a snow cone maker, very traditional, and started making snow cones. And that was a big hit with the kids. It was such a big hit that these kids offered to do the dishes by themselves. It's been documented for posterity. 2 boys did the dishes on their own without being told. Beautiful thing. And then, so you can see, these are some of the baskets that have been made from the twigs of this plant. And so Melinda's over there, and she sees this bush. It's looking very gnarly. It needs to be pruned back. And so by pruning it, by burning the bushes, it will necessitate the growth of long, straight basketry stems. And so a lot of times we've lost that relationship with the land, and so these aren't being pruned to the degree that they should anymore because people aren't doing basketry, and so this is an important part of what we're teaching. And then in the process, we teach the names of the plant names, trying to teach the heritage language. A lot of children that grow up today aren't growing up in homes where there's 2 fluent speakers. There's already been a generation of language loss, so it's very hard for language transmission when you're not in an immersion environment where it's spoken in the home. So we do try and document the language. And one thing that occurred to us is that, in regular conversational Hualapai, you talk about food, you talk about the weather, you talk about how you're doing, but you don't necessarily talk about esoteric items that we don't use anymore, like a kathak or a kathu, a large burden basket or a small burden basket, because we go to Walmart and we use Tupperware and glassware, and so that's what you talk about. And so some of these words are in danger of being lost, and it really comprises some of the traditional ecological knowledge because these items are made from plants, they have special relationships with harvesting plants, and so being able to know the names and how they're used is important knowledge. So a godid is a winnowing basket, a gwedid is a parching basket. So this has to be constructed in such a way that you can put hot coals in it and roast your piñon nuts, and it's not going to burn a hole in the basket. And so each item is constructed in such a way with the knowledge of what the purpose is for. Yachavi seed beater baskets. And then the prickly pear, this ripens in our region like towards the end of the summertime. You can harvest with using tongs. You can harvest the fruit and dust off all the glochids, the very fine spines. And then you can juice it and make prickly pear juice, prickly pear jelly, prickly pear ice cream, prickly pear yogurt, prickly pear sumac, and gummy bears. Really high in a lot of nutritional value: magnesium, calcium, vitamin C, potassium, fiber. Also medicinal. The pulp can be applied to wounds and cuts and sunburns. The mesquite, this is another important plant. Every part of this plant has a use. The edible bean pods ripen towards the end of the summertime. They can be pulverized into an edible flour. And so when they become dry and brittle and yellow, you can grind it on the grinding stone. We tried a meat grinder to speed things along. It turns out that industrial hammer mill is the most efficient way to process mesquite beans in the modern era. And I believe Yavapai Apache down in Camp Verde, they purchased a large one that's the size of a vehicle almost, and they sometimes will open it up to community to bring mesquite beans to get processed. And I know down in Tucson they do the same thing. And so makes a really delicious flour that's low on the glycemic index. It's really good for diabetics. It slows the absorption of nutrients so your blood sugar doesn't spike, and it tastes very good. It's very nutty and sweet tasting. And also you can boil the beans and make a juice that can then be turned into a jelly. It tastes very similar to honey. The root of the plant is used as the frame of the cradle board. The limbs can be used as the Das Fix sticks for the field hockey. And even the pitch of the mesquite can be boiled down and concentrated into a black dye that was used to dye your hair. So you got the beauty cream, you got the hair dye. Vanity knows no cultural boundaries. And then manat is the banana yucca. And so all the yuccas have a special relationship with a certain pollinator species. It's a mutualist, obligate relationship. So each yucca has its own yucca moth that pollinates it, and their fates are intertwined. If something happens to the moth or to the yucca, they can't persist on the landscape without one another. So it's a symbiosis. And so we want to, if you're going to get fruit, it all depends on if you're going to get you look to see if you're going to get flowers, if you're going to get fruit, and that all depends on if they get pollinated. So the moths are very important. So you don't get fruit every year. This is similar to pinon. It cycles. There's good years and bad years, and so every 3 or 4 years you get a really nice bumper crop. You can eat it fresh. It's good to also roast it. So it has these seeds. You remove the seeds. And so you can just do a little surface fire. We went to the school and made a fire and started roasting the banana yucca. It turns out when you light a fire without the permission of the fire department in the 21st century, it's a big no-no. So you have the kids hold hands and look cute because the fire guys are coming after you. Also, the agave and the yucca have very fibrous plant parts, the leaves, and so you can boil them and pound on them and scrape away the pith and get that inner fiber, and that can be made into cordage, which can be made into, like this hairbrush, a sandal, a rope, or a net. And so the nets were used for harvesting rabbits on a communal scale. And so the Hualapai name is Manat of the banana yucca, and it's always like a challenge to remember the tribal name. So if you want to remember the name, if you're going to weave one of these nets, it's going to be a lot of monotonous work. Also, the root of the plant has a lot of saponins, and so you can break it open, put it under water, apply friction, and it starts lathering up like soap, and it's used ceremonially for hair washes, washing your hair. Co is the pinon. So this one produces an edible nut inside the cone, and so Kodav is making the pinon nut butter. Nowadays a lot of people just go out in the forest and they pick up the nuts one by one, and that's just the easy way to do it in our modern lives. But the older way was early in the season when the cones are green and they're on the tree, you send a child up to go knock down all the cones, or you get a knocking stick and you knock them down. And then you take those green cones and you light a fire, and then they pop open like popcorn, and then you knock out all the nuts. And then later in the season, there's a second harvest when all the cones open up on their own on the trees and drop the nuts. And so there's really 2 harvesting seasons. Nowadays, we just do the second harvest. Usually, some people may do the old way, but back in the 1980s and 90s, they had a very active ethnobotanical program at the school because they had received federal funding to do bilingual education. So they were teaching the heritage language, and they created a lot of curriculum in the heritage language that was actually based on ethnobotany. And so when I came along and was able to do my ethnobotany programming, I already had a dream team because I was working with all the retired teachers that had already taught all of this at the school, and they had built a whole curriculum around it. So it was just a really ample time to be working with the tribal elders that had been doing this already for decades. And it was a great time because when I came along, it was after so in 2000, the state of Arizona passed English-only legislation, and it was geared towards Spanish immigrants that were speaking Spanish, but it affected the tribal schools. And so it effectively prohibited tribal schools from teaching their heritage languages, even though heritage languages are not foreign languages. In any case, so this bilingual program had pretty much dissolved. It had been active from the late 70s up until almost 2000, and then it dissipated. And so by 2006, it was like a perfect transition to pick back up. And the ethnobotany program that I facilitate with the elders is outside of school. It's not part of the school curriculum, but it's an outside activity. And so you can also roast the nuts in the oven, make the pinon butter. We were making, instead of fry bread, we were making bread on hot coals, and we were putting our pinon butter on that. We were doing a documentary, so we were filming everything, and we were going through our footage, and Lethan, who's now a grown man, but he was a little boy in this photo, he was like, "This is delicious," which is great when you hear them talking that way about the traditional foods, because a lot of times everybody wants the modern stuff. And then you can also make the nut butter with the shell on. It's a little more extra fiber. And then you can harvest the pinon sap. It's medicinal. It has antimicrobial properties. It also acts as a drawing agent, so you can apply it directly to a wound. It acts just like Neosporin. In our modern world, we make salve. We make a medicinal salve, so we take the sap, beeswax, and oil, and we create a topical salve so that you're not rubbing sticky pitch on your wounds, but that's the old way of doing it. The wild turnip, this is edible in the early springtime, the Somopteris genus. Tastes almost like a potato, a little different, starchy root crop. Cholla buds, these are actually edible, but they're covered in thorns, so you have to remove all the thorns. It's extremely high in calcium. 2 tablespoons has more calcium than a glass of milk and far less fat. And it also has digestible pectins that are good for the diabetics. And so you can eat them fresh or boiled, or you can dry them. And when you dry them, then you can pulverize them into a flour, and you can mix it into a water and make a medicinal beverage. And then jikyal, this is the cliff rose bark. This can be made into clothing, also made into bedding for the cradle board. And this is a Hualapai match. And so when you have to create fire by friction, it's so much effort, you want to keep your fire lit. And so you would light the tip of that, and you'd hold on to the loop, and then the firekeeper would go throughout the camps in the village and light everybody's fire in the morning time. Ethov is the arrowweed. This is used for arrow shafts and also for the cross pieces of the cradle board. It can also be used in a bow drill for making fire. And can be used as thatch for wickiups, and also can be used similar to how white sage is used as a purification. So in closing, thank you guys for staying with me this evening. I know we covered a lot. I just have some closing thoughts, and then we can have a couple minutes for questions. Long before the arrival of European settlers to the region, the tribal groups of the Mojave Desert had acquired great mastery of what to some is a seemingly barren, forbidden, fruitless landscape. No one can attempt to understand the tribal groups without soon becoming aware that they were and are master ecologists, and that in their worldview and ideologies, there is an ecological model as keenly geared to empirical experience as any Western scientific paradigms utilized by contemporary botanists and ecologists of today. From the natural world, tribal people of the Mojave Desert could identify plant species in all stages of livelihood and season. They learned how, when, and where to harvest and process plants, including berries, seeds, nuts, and bean pods. They dug roots, bulbs, and rhizomes and brewed a multitude of teas. They harvested fresh plant shoots, greens, and buds, and found spices for their foods. From plants, they acquired medicines to heal the sick and injured. Some plants were valued for their spiritual and ceremonial properties. Some were used to perfume their homes and sweat lodges. Plants were used to smoke in pipes. They were made into shampoos and hair tonics, and also were used for their insecticide properties. Plants were used for dyes and to manufacture important materials, including baskets, bows, arrows, quivers, and other harvesting implements like the yucca rabbit net. Hopefully this presentation has touched on the vastness, beauty, and complexity of the Mojave Desert flora and shed light on the precise and expansive scientific knowledge base of the tribal groups that call this region home. Thank you.
So, we have time for question and answer, and since we have an online audience, it would be great if you would ask your question into the microphone.
Could you explain, when you were talking about that one plant that had a colonal aspect to it, I didn't quite understand. I mean, I figured it means clone, but I wasn't too sure.
Yeah, so the Mojave yucca, it can create a new plant through pollination, which would be more genetically diverse, but it also has an ability to reproduce asexually through like root shoots. And the way that scientists have been able to, predict how old these plants are is they study growth rates. So they'll say, okay, well, a yucca grows 1 millimeter in one season, and they measure, because they fan out in rings, so they measure the center of the ring and then the outer ring, and then they extrapolate, oh, this plant is 10,000 years old. And so nobody was around that long ago. None of us were. There were people, but so this is all extrapolation, and it's a ballpark.
I have a question about the mescal agave. Who was the smart person who figured it out that you should eat it then and not die? You know, I mean, is there a sense of how that process took place?
You know, that's something that a lot of people contemplate, because there's people mostly always say trial and error, and that's the answer for everything. And it's interesting when you consider some indigenous people will have a different take on that, and then they have a deeper relationship with plants, at least in days gone by, and some people still today, where they were guided through dreams on how to prepare plants. And so this quick and easy, dirty answer is, oh yeah, they trial and error. So you try a little bit, and then hopefully you don't die. Or, but then also there's this supernatural element, this other realm that are we opening ourselves up to be guided to these uses, and that is a big part of indigenous people's relationship with plants. So.
Do you think that there is a definite way in order to preserve these indigenous cultures and traditions into the modern day, despite the, shall we say, disuse of the objects that you were saying, for example, how you were losing certain words because the objects were no longer used? Is there any kind of way in order to preserve the use of those words at all? I was just wondering more on that aspect.
Yeah, that's an important thing to draw attention to. And so we kind of have two different approaches. One is to just document everything in written form, and that's like for posterity. But really, what I try to focus on in my work is to make it a living practice and tradition, or keep it a living practice and tradition, so that it can persist in the host culture. So as long as people are still practicing it, and they're passing it down to the next generation, then it still has vitality. And so I really believe in practicing these traditions, and documenting is also an important aspect of that. But if people stop practicing it and then you go back to a book and you try and figure it out, you're gonna get it not 100% how it was intended. That's just how it is. It's like when you're reading, somebody could give you a manual on how to ride a bike, but until mom and dad put you on the bike, you just have to figure it out. And so I think by doing it, and then, what I love about this venue tonight is the Natural History Institute, is essentially doing that, is providing opportunities for all ages to engage with nature. And so we've become such a, just modern world where we're inundated by, modern devices, that we have kind of fallen away from nature. And so the young people coming up don't have the same experiences that their grandparents had, where they were out playing in nature all day. Instead, they're using their device, and so there's a big disconnect. And you don't want to save something if you haven't been exposed to it. And so, having those hands-on experiences is really crucial.
Is anybody still doing basketry other than as an occasional effort?
There's just 3 or 4 people that are still master basket weavers, and then there's a few other people that take an interest and learn from them. But that particular art is so time involved that's one that's definitely fading to the wayside. I think there's more people that make cradle boards than there are people that make baskets. And it's just, learning to weave is only one aspect. Harvesting the materials, knowing the plant, splitting them, it's so hard to split them without them, just shredding. Yeah, that's a tough one. It's hard to keep that one going. Thankfully we're doing the traditional agave roast, because a lot of tribes have kind of fallen away from that. So I'm glad that there's still things in the community that are being maintained. But some of these things that are extremely time involved, they're just, there's not enough, people that are passing it on. So, yeah.
All right, well, I think Carrie's going to stick around for a little bit, so if you have that question that you don't want to ask right now, perhaps you can ask that of her in a moment, and come up and see the materials, as well as invite you into the gallery. Why don't you join me in thanking Carrie and
Thank you.
as a sign of our respect and thanks, the
Thank you.
Natural History Institute hat.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good night.